following podcast you're about to listen to is a part 2 of the previous interview that we've released on the show for you to enjoy. Be sure to check out the first one if you haven't. Enjoy the show. I know one question you'll be able to answer. This one's an interesting one. What exactly do you think Del Toro would order at Starbucks? Because is it true that you went out to Starbucks with him, I believe? Am I correct?
There was, well, I should say, yes, I did. That's funny. I don't even remember telling this story. I guess I must have, no, but it was when we were both working at DreamWorks, and he was starting to develop, what became these big, these 3 miniseries that have, or 3 or 4 that have all woven together, the Arcadia world. And he was doing some work. He was going to end up doing some work on Rise of the Guardians as well. But they had a Starbucks on site at the DreamWorks studio, and so a lot of people would come in and out of there. And so, it was, if I was lucky to meet anybody famous, it was there, when he had an office and an assistant there and everything. And he was really generous with his time. I don't know if you've ever heard a presentation by him, but he's really down to earth, very humble, very low key, loves other film animation nerds, doesn't put on airs at all. And so, like if I was going to be able to talk to anybody famous, it's probably as good of a chance as I was going to get with him as well. So I just told him what a big fan I was of his work. And then I was curious as to what he was doing at DreamWorks. I don't even remember so much of what he said other than he was really nice, really friendly, and obviously very eager to talk about movies and what he liked about them and what other people had done that he respected. I think maybe I asked him a little bit. He had either co-produced or served as an advisor on somebody else's movie that I think we watched at the studio, which was about a blind woman that has to solve a murder mystery. It was really dark, really gruesome in places, but very interesting. It felt very much like the kind of movie that he would make. But yeah, he is cool. He did a number of presentations at DreamWorks about his process and the way he writes films and the kinds of films that he admires and what he likes about them. So yeah, he was a great resource. As far as I know, he may still be there developing new properties for them. I'm not sure. I still want to see his Haunted Mansion, dang it. Have you seen Nightmare Alley yet?
I don't think I have, no.
Oh, it's great. It's great. I really liked it anyway. It's just all, old-fashioned, carny drama and intrigue, the sideshow freaks. It's a murder mystery, a film noir, a dream cast like you wouldn't believe. I think it might be my favorite movie of his after Pan's Labyrinth. Really, really entertaining. Really great stuff.
Yeah, and you're mentioning DreamWorks because you worked with Disney for a bit on Bolt, and then there was all this promotional stuff. You even had like a Bolt themed birthday party, which I saw. You had like a Rhino cake and all that, and you it was for your 40th birthday. And after that, then you left Disney,
that's right, yeah.
And you went to DreamWorks. And I remember seeing and hearing about how you really enjoyed getting there and doing all that. One thing I thought it'd be kind of cool to talk about was you mentioned how you were getting closer to accomplishing one of your life goals, which was to improv, in front of an audience, and you had the opportunity to do that with some of the DreamWorks staff. And can you I don't know if you could tell us a little bit about just what that was like, improving and doing that on stage.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, so I had a lot of friends, that I knew that actually did improv at the Comedy Store and different places around Los Angeles. And my thought was like, man, that is so cool. I wish I had the guts and the talent to do something like that. But man, being the pressure of being spontaneous and creative and committed to a character and listening to people and doing all that stuff on the spot in front of an audience just sounded completely terrifying to me. And just that I was just afraid I would completely bomb if I tried to do something like that. So when this guy, they had this guy, they actually had a couple of people come into Disney that had us do exercises while I was there, and I loved the exercises because I thought, well, if I mess this up, who cares? I mean, nobody but my fellow coworkers are going to see it, and then there were times like, oh man, why did I do this? Why didn't I commit to this? Why didn't I say yes instead of no, as they say, but then they had a guy who was clearly coming in on a regular basis. I found out later that he was, I don't know if he was married at the time, but probably pretty steady with somebody who was a creative executive at DreamWorks at the time, which is probably a big reason why, he was who knows? Maybe he was an established part of the studio already, and that's how they got to know each other and got together. Anyway, he was great, and he did these workshops for anybody at the studio who wanted to participate in them. And so there were times when I wasn't even on a film where I was attending his workshop every week, and yeah, they would do a show, I think once a year, for anybody at the studio, and they would even invite people from the outside to see it. And I will tell you, I don't think I did very well at all in any of the productions that we did. I guess I just think of times I froze up or stumbled or missed opportunities, but I'm thrilled that I did it. I mean? I can say that I tried to do it and I gave it my best and I committed to it. I was actually doing extra practices with other people in the class, between our workshops, our weekly workshops, or if the guy was sick or out of town that week, I'd say, hey, let's get together. It just became kind of an addiction for me. That's what, there were so many great things that were afforded us on the DreamWorks campus. I don't know if they're still doing all those things or some of those things, now that Illumination has kind of taken over, the DreamWorks animation wing, if they're saving money. But at the time, you could just live there almost if they would have had beds. They had showers. You could, there was someplace somebody showed me once that I don't think I ever used it, but you could take a shower there if you had to. But they had everything. Free food for breakfast and lunch, and really good food too. Really healthy food if you wanted to have it. They had a doctor on site. They had, a lake and a stream that you could walk around, as if you were out in the woods. Just a fitness center, an arcade, just about everything you could possibly dream of, which I think they did on purpose so that people would be encouraged to stick around instead of driving a long ways to go out and get lunch or dinner. I mean, it worked for me. I loved being there. Every office it seemed like most of the offices had a window, and it was great. My friend said it was like I was working at a resort. It's kind of true.
I can totally get that. Me and my sister would always talk about working at Pixar, because you would watch all these videos, and I was curious, have you ever gone to Pixar just to visit and look around? Because I don't think you have, from my research, worked on any Pixar related projects. I
have not. I had a former, actually he wasn't a former student of mine. He was, when I was teaching at Cal Arts, Dan Holland was a student there who did a student film that I really admired. And I think that's how I reached out to him and said, hey, this is a great film. You should really go somewhere with this. Well, he ended up becoming a superstar at Pixar. And when Pixar was looking for story people, he put my name in the hat and got them to arrange to give me an interview, which I thought was really nice of him. And so, it was funny because they had this really strange relationship with Disney at the time, where there was this kind of this anti-poaching thing, that everybody was paranoid of, we don't want you stealing our employees from us, and so we're going to do all these things to make sure you don't do this. And so typically if Pixar was interested in somebody who was working for Disney, they had to wait until they were officially fired from Disney before they could approach them, I guess, you know, or until their contract was finished or whatever. At the time, I guess I didn't have a contract, or my contract was I can't remember if it was going to expire or it already had expired and it hadn't been renewed yet. And as soon as Disney got wind that I was being approached for an interview, they offered me more money and all these things not to take the interview, you know. And I talked to one of the, you know, I talked to the head of the studio at the time, Pam Coates, and she said, look, if you want to take this interview, that's fine. You know, I'm not going to try to talk you out of it or whatever, but I would just say, take the interview, come back and let's talk, and we'll talk about what we can do to make you want to stay here, which I thought was nice. You know, she was awesome, Pam Coates. And so I went up there. They flew me up there. They let me have a meal in their commissary, you know, with all these glass windows, you know, beautiful, you know, glass windows everywhere. You know, want to make it as open and free sounding as possible. And I think there was a while where they really tried to make the Disney studio feel more like the Pixar studio. They were kind of jealous, you know, of that kind of open air campus feel. And then I got escorted into a story room where they had old Toy Story 2 boards, and I think that's all they had. Maybe they had a couple of drawings from Monsters, Inc. And they would just have one group of directors and heads of story come in after another and talk to me and ask me about stuff and ask me what filmmakers I liked and the way that I liked to work. And you know, could I do animatics? And I was like, I don't know. I haven't done that before. You know, one group of people asked me like what I thought of the storyboards on The Incredibles and could I storyboard like that? I was like, maybe. And inside I'm thinking, no, I can't draw like that. You know, I don't know if you've seen the Incredible storyboards. They were completely different than what had been done, from my understanding, at Pixar at the time, which were mostly really rough, you know, drawings done in you know, charcoal or carpenter's crayon, you know, really much more focused on the characters and the performances and the story than they were on locking down the camera, you know, or the backgrounds or whatever. All that was going to be, you know, kind of refined and settled in layout later. Whereas the way Brad Bird likes to work is he wants to figure out everything as precisely as possible in the storyboards. So the drawings are super tight. They look exactly like the characters. You know, the camera moves are done, you know, in with the storyboards. There's often animation and CGI effects layered on top of the drawings, you know, very, very, very precise and tons of work, and scared the crap out of me. I thought, I can't draw like that. I not on the timetable that they're going to want anyway, you know. And then somebody that I'd worked on a previous project at Disney, who was one of the few people I'd like to think who did not have a good experience with me, who basically said, so are you better to work with now than you were when I was there? And I was like, I guess so. I think I've improved, you know. I was told later that he was the person who basically made sure I did not get a job at Pixar. I can't say that I know that that's true, but it would, I believe it. I believe that it's probable. Anyway, I mean, who knows? I mean, you know, maybe I just didn't impress anybody enough, you know, but he was the guy who had worked with me before and knew me. And because he had doubts, you know, I think that was probably, it would have been more than enough. But so he's the last person who kind of, so I'm going, oh no, that didn't go well. And then this woman who brought me in says, so do you have any questions? And I'm like, yeah, can you tell me like what shows these people are looking for story artists from? No. Okay, can you tell me what's in production right now? No. Could I look around the studio and see? No. Okay, I heard you have a swimming pool on campus. Could I see that? Oh no, you'd have to walk past this really high security, you know. No. Can I call you a cab back to the airport? Okay. And that was, you know, but what I ended up doing is like on my way out, I said, hey, this person who set up the interview for me, Dan Holland, could I give him a call? And I gave him a call and said, oh, dude, here, come on, I'll talk to you for a while. I'll show you a couple of offices around Pixar. I'll show you to the pool. But that was the entirety of my Pixar experience. I have to say, there were people. Of course, Lasseter ended up coming to work for at Disney as kind of their head creative officer. So I had more than a few projects, and they had, oh great, now I can't think of one of the most beloved story artists at Pixar who tragically died in a car accident. He did the voice of Heimlich in A Bug's Life.
Joe. Wait, no.
Joe Ram.
Yeah,
thank you.
I was looking at that.
And he did stuff. Yeah, and he did stuff on Nightmare Before Christmas at Disney, a few other things. Yeah, he came in and did a little clinic on storyboarding. It was just wonderful. He's such a sweet, heartfelt, honest guy. Really, really, really wonderful. But yeah, that was my moment. I actually, at some point, I convinced myself that I was going to get the job at Pixar after that interview, and I was like, oh man, I'm going to have to move up to the Bay Area, and it'll be way more expensive, and I probably won't get paid as much because they're not a union studio, but I'll make it work somehow. You'll see. And San Francisco and the Bay Area is so cool, and it didn't happen. But here's the thing: had that happened, a lot of things would be very different. And the chief among which was I never would have done Rhino on Bolt. So who knows how long I would have actually lasted up there. But yeah, basically the highlight of my career would have not happened at all. Maybe something else would have happened, although I kind of doubt it. I think that, again, being at Disney as long as I had and making as many friends and connections for as long as I had, all kind of came together for me to do that voice on that film at that time. So, thank goodness for what's the country song? Thank God for unanswered prayers. It was a good thing that things didn't work out the way I thought I wanted them to, or that they were going to at the time.
Yeah. One interesting thing, one thing I thought was interesting, because you left Disney in 2009, but I'm not sure if this was correct on your IMDb, but there's a few Disney projects that you worked on after the fact that you left, or I'm not sure how it works at Disney, but Tangled. I'm not sure if you worked on that, maybe? There's a few.
I think I'd have to go back and look at my IMDb page. There were a few movies that they credited me working on that I never worked on. I did work on I think I mentioned the previous version of Rapunzel. Actually I worked on 3 previous versions of Rapunzel. One was supposedly going to be directed by Ron and John, if I remember correctly. They were going to be in some creative capacity on it anyway. That was much more of a straight retelling of the original story, except for the witch was going to repent of her evil ways and be redeemed at the end of the movie, actually. And it turned out she actually did love Rapunzel and, repented of her evil ways. I worked on the other crazy kind of fractured fairy tale Shrek-ish version of it. There was also a musical. I worked on another version that directly preceded what came out as Tangled, where the romantic lead was a big, heavy guy. He was also a thief, but he was named Bastian, and he was kind of an inventor that, tinkered with machines. And there was going to be this whole thing where there was a water fountain that was hooked up to complicated machinery that drove the fountains and aqueducts in the city that was broken, and he was going to end up figuring out a way to fix it. It was kind of the steampunk type of story. And Rapunzel, they were going out of their way to say, okay, what would Rapunzel really be like if she had been kidnapped as a child and raised in almost total isolation by a psychopath, And so she's not the bubbly, happy-go-lucky, smiling, well-adjusted girl that ended up being entangled. She painted faces on her chairs and her table and the rocks in her room, and were talking, they had conversations with all the inanimate objects there, and was just doing her best to stay sane in an insane environment. Um, and some of the things were the same. Mother Gothel was relatively similar, although she actually had a job in the palace that she was going back and forth to, and nobody's suspected who she was, and that's how she got access to Rapunzel in the first place. As a nursemaid or a servant or something like that. But yeah, I left the studio just before they started the version that became Tangled. Actually, no, that's not true. They started the version that was going to be Tangled just before I left. That's right. Yeah. But I never contributed anything to that particular version of the story. I mean, I guess some people might say that some of the stuff that I did I did some visual development of, how Rapunzel washed and dried her hair and other things. Maybe they influenced the final version. Maybe they didn't, So yeah, I don't know if that was how that came about or if it was just a mistake, just a computer glitch. Yeah, I also at one time I was credited as working on the Nut Job too, and I never did anything on that. I think I got a credit on Zootopia. I never worked on that. But one of my star students from Cal Arts had a story on that and did a voice on that, and now she's a big shot at Disney Studios. So, I'd like to think that I somehow influenced the making of that. Maybe I didn't either, but I have a connection there at least, So yeah, I wish I'd done something on Zootopia. That was amazing, and as was Tangled actually. But yeah.
Yeah, one thing I thought was interesting was looking at your work at Blue Sky. I've always been fond of the movie Epic. I feel like it's very underappreciated. I'm not sure what you think about it, but I watched it yesterday and like the story is just so beautiful. The everything, and you worked as according to what I saw, a visual development, which from what I looked at, it's like, if I'm wrong, you can correct me on this, but it's like designing the background and everything like that, like the atmosphere.
What I did, I should say I was only attached to that film for a few weeks. There were people that I knew at the studio who had worked on it for years, and what I basically did was watch the movie as it was at the time, and they were looking for ways to inject humor and comedy and heart into what was already there. So were there opportunities where we could put a joke in there or some funny bit of physical or character business, without really changing anything, just kind of adding to, and juicing up the material that was there. So I came up with ideas for things. I came up with a lot of ideas for the way that Nim, the caterpillar / magician / club owner, whatever it, / archivist, they didn't really feel like they had a handle on exactly who he was or what he was about. And they wanted to do some stuff with him to kind of solidify his character. So I came up with a whole intro sequence of how he plays music on an organ and he introduces people. He does a little bit of matchmaking and he does dancing, all this stuff. They didn't use any of it, but I had fun coming up with it in any case. And I came up with some jokes for Mub and Grub, which they did not use. I thought some of them were kind of funny. I came up with one which probably wasn't very politically correct, but I thought it was funnier than the business that they had in the rest of the movie anyway. Maybe that's why they had the good taste not to use it. I'll tell you, there's one gag that I personally was kind of proud of, and they sounded as if they liked it. So I'm kind of surprised they didn't put it in. It's where, if your listeners are not familiar with the story, there's a seed pod that is going to confer the power to become the next princess, queen of, the wildlands, the garden, whatever this area, this patch of land is out in the woods, over all the plants and insects and hybrids, in between. And so there's this fight between the good guys and the bad guys to get control of the seed pod, right? And the bad guy that wears the skin of a bat uh, and has the power of rot. He wants the seed pod because he wants to become the ruler over everything. And so there was going to be this scene where Mub and Grub and the caterpillar that I mentioned are all trying to protect the seed pod. And I came up with this idea where the caterpillar, the caterpillar is standing between the bad guy and his troops and the seed pod, and he says, like, "Hey, you don't want to see a magic trick?" And the guy says, "Oh yes, you're a real magician, aren't you?" It's like, "Well, I only have one trick, but it's a pretty good one. Want to see it?" And they're just looking at him, kind of like whatever. And he takes this green, sparkly fabric out from his pocket and drapes it over himself. And they're all going, "Okay, time's up. Give us a seed pod." And they come and they push him out of the way, and the fabric just billows out, and there's nothing underneath. And they're looking around, but so he's gone, but so is the seed pod. And then they hear, and there's this giant moth that's flying up out of the roof with the seed pod. "Yeah, it's a great trick, but I can only do it once." I'm like, get him. They start throwing spears. I thought this was so great, right? Because he's a caterpillar. And he's supposed to do. I don't even know if that ended up in the finished. Excuse me. In the finished movie of him trying to do these amateur magic tricks or whatever. I thought this is a great arc for his story, right? He does this one last thing, and it's kind of cool. It's kind of, makes him seem like there was more to him than met the eye after all. But that and he said, "Wow, nobody's ever tried that with that character." Chris Wedge said at the time, "It's like, hey, I bet you no, nothing happened with it." So, it was fun. It was fun. I will say that when they showed us the reels, I think I was not as careful politically as I could have been. I kind of said, I don't know, the story has a lot of problems, and I don't really like, the main character. He does all these things that end up, like, the queen ends up getting killed because he wasn't on duty, and then he kind of goofs off, and the seed pod is stolen because he's not doing his job, and and then he. Are we supposed to like this guy? Are we supposed to care about him? Are we supposed to want him to get together with the girl? And the rules of the world are kind of complicated and wishy-washy. I'm not sure how anything works. And I think they got the message that, like, I did not appreciate all the hard work that they put into getting the movie to the point that it was. And that I thought it was, I was talking about it like, well, I think you're going to need bigger changes than the ones you want me to make, man, to really make it sing, and I have to say, as it turned out, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff, in the film. My biggest disappointment with that film was that they did not go with the original title, which was The Leaf Men, as it was until, like, I don't know, a couple of months before the movie came out. Epic just kind of, at least for a lot of us, materialized out of thin air, because these test audiences said, "Well, leaf men, I don't know. That's excluding women. Shouldn't be the leaf people or the leaf men and women? Oh, that's kind of complicated." And I think a lot of people were just saying, this just doesn't sound epic enough. Wait a minute, epic, and I was like, epic? You're calling the movie epic? It's like saying blockbuster, the movie. It's like, what does that tell you about the movie? Well, it's going to be a blockbuster, And I remember one of the other story artists that had worked on it for years. They were telling their aunt or grandmother something, like how annoyed they were, and there was they told the story. I was like, oh, I don't know. I mean, when it was called The Leaf Man, I'm not very interested in watching a story about Leaf Man, but epic sounds pretty exciting. Like, oh. Okay, I guess they're right. Everybody's crazy. What do we know about what people want to see, right? So who knows? I don't know if Epic ended up helping the film or hurting it, or maybe it didn't make any difference either way. I also thought Tangled was a ridiculous title for what was supposed to be Rapunzel, but it did, the film did really well, and thus began, the trend of, adverbs, tangled, frozen, burnt, whatever, that seemed to have, had great success at the different studios. So, just goes to show you, we should all stay in our lanes and not tell the ad executives what to do, because apparently they know what they're doing better than we do, right?
But yeah, I actually had two questions. I'm like, maybe I can ask that one, but I'm not sure if that's a long one. And I also had like the final question. My first question was, in the movies that you've like worked on, you're working with all these talented people like in a work environment, and you're supposed to be professional and serious working in that environment, but sometimes funny things happen. And I was wondering if there's ever been an instance that you can think of on the top of your head where something funny happened and it was something that was memorable.
Oh, lots of funny. I mean, you've got very creative people, that are very funny, have great senses of humor, or they wouldn't have the jobs that they do, especially the people that are writing dialogue or storyboarding, or, coming up with the ideas for movies in the first place. And, a lot of them have become friends if they've worked at the studio for a long time together. They know each other well and are pretty comfortable with one another. And, there'll be times either because there's kind of a lag in production where we're waiting for material to work on, or a project is stalled for whatever reason, or we're in the middle of a project and the pressure is on and there's a lot of tension and we're working long hours and we're tired, and people want to blow off a little steam, and relax a little bit, to get their second wind back to, getting back into the fires of production and what have you. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of, horsing around and goofing around when the time is right and it's appropriate. They did a lot of socializing and parties at the studio as well, after productions or in the middle of productions, to help people get to know each other, or to socialize and whatnot, or a little weekend, happy weekend parties, even if half of us are going to work through the weekend and through the night, but I can think of one of the many times when I was working on what was called Rapunzel Unbraided at the time, that kind of wacky version of Rapunzel with Glenn Keane when he was going to direct the movie. And they were doing, I don't remember if it was every week. It might have been every week, or maybe it was every other week. They had a production office for each movie usually, where a lot of people could work, together in little offices to, close to each other, to ask questions and run stuff by each other. And so we'd gather in the Rapunzel production office, which was the old ink and paint part of the studio when they did ink and paint, before it all switched over to computers. And they wanted to they'd do karaoke, anybody who could do karaoke. And I remember, I can't remember if somebody dared me to do it or if I just thought it would be funny to do Like a Virgin by Madonna. And they had a long wig that, I don't know, must have been at least 4, maybe even 5 feet long. They were going to use it as reference, for the animators and the programmers and whatnot, to see how long hair behaved in the physical world, and so I started singing the song in this really ridiculous falsetto, and I put the wig on. I was flipping it around, and of course, if you're probably not old enough to have ever even seen the video or even heard the song, but in the music video, Madonna is being as provocative as possible. So, I'm like leaning up against columns in the room, and leaning my head way back, and flipping my hair back and forth. And at some point, I think I took a can of garbage, just dumped it all over my head, and was writhing around on the floor, and crumpled up pieces of paper and candy wrappers, like a virgin, feel your heartbeat, ooh, next to mine. Anyway, some people would say that was one of their more memorable experiences at the studio, those that were there to witness it. I don't know for if it was for all the wrong reasons or not. But you know, that was something that I enjoyed. Anyway, I'm trying to think if there was. I mean, they did one thing that was a lot of fun. They didn't do it every year, but a lot of years that I was working there, they would have an April Fool's Day caricature show where all the different people, because a lot of people like me liked to do caricatures and do caricatures of each other during the day, you know, during the, while we were working on stuff, you know, while we were in meetings, supposedly listening to what was happening, we're just instead of drawing funny pictures of each other. And so they would put, all these, the best caricatures that people had, you know, up on the walls for people to admire and laugh. I'll say, oh, that looks just like you. You look so stupid. And I did a variety of April Fool's pranks different years while I was there. And one of them was that we decided it would be funny. Just for fun, we, two or three of us that were on Home on the Range decided that we were going to invent an employee and submit his caricatures to the caricature show. And I don't know if I lobbied for it, if I was designated the official artist. So I would draw really bad caricatures of people with my left hand because I'm right-handed that were really sloppy and, you know, asymmetrical, and, you know, and all of them had the same lumpy body and same kind of gumdrop head, you know, and squashed feet and caveman hands. You know, the only thing that would change would be like the hair or a beard or, you know, the shirts, or I think I even drew the clothes the same as much. And I would write their name with my left hand really badly, you know. And my friend came up with he found one of his old high school yearbooks of this guy with an afro and a big nose, and you know, we made up a fake Disney ID for him and everything, and submitted to. And we were just having so much fun doing these caricatures. And then just before the caricature show, the different people that submitted these caricatures on behalf of, now I can't even remember the name of the guy. I'll have to ask my friend about it. They started getting these calls like, so who is this guy and who does he work for? And they contacted one of the production assistants, you know, who totally freaked out. Said, it was a joke. He's not a real guy. He's not a real person. I'm so sorry. Please don't fire me. You know, like, oh, thanks a lot, man. Cracked under the pressure, you know. And so basically once they found out that he wasn't real, they wouldn't put any of our caricatures. So I undaunted went around like the night the night before the caricature show was unveiled, and I put up posters, you know, in between, and printed up a little thing of saying who it was and who it was by. And they didn't take them down for a couple of weeks. And the funny thing was that one of the people that I did a horrible caricature of was just freaked out that this guy had drawn him and he didn't know who it was, and he couldn't figure out who he worked for. And so he, you know, so every once in a while I would write a note to him and say, I'm watching you, Chad. You know, I know where you work, Chad. You know, I was like, dude, is it you? Where are you? Where are you? You know, and I think I wrote in his yearbook, you know, when he left the studio. It was really terrible. I can't remember if I ever told him what the joke was or not, but we had a good, we had some laughs at it anyway. So anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
And so out of all the projects you've worked on, which project would you say you've grown from? You know, you worked on this project, like which one helped you grow as an artist?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a hard question. I mean, I'd like to say, I think I can honestly say I've grown at least a little bit, if not a lot, from everything that I've done, you know, because different stories, working with different people, different subject matter, you know, you're always doing something a little bit different, and sometimes stuff that's outside of your comfort zone, sometimes even stuff that's within your comfort zone, you learn how to do it better. One of the projects that comes to mind pretty readily was I worked on what was to become next gen. At the time, it was like codenamed 7723 or Steelheart. Yeah, I don't know if you saw the project. I think it's still on Netflix. Netflix ended up buying it and releasing it. About a robot that is. It was intended to be a war machine. There was this whole world where I don't even know if this ended up in the finished movie or not, but in the world, basically, people don't get killed in wars anymore because robots are doing all the fighting for them. And so, if your country's robots win, well, then you win, and if yours don't, then you're occupied by the forces. But at least none of you are getting, suffering the horrors of war. And so this was designed to be a awful fighting machine, and the machine ends up escaping because it turns out that it's more complicated and human-like than it was given credit for, and it befriends a girl, and the girl kind of teaches it how to be like a person even more. And of course, things end up that the robot gets a chance at redemption and to be friends with the girl. And it's funny because at the time that we were working on this movie, I don't think there was anything like it. And since that movie has come out, there's been at least a couple of other movies, like Ron's Gone Wrong just came out. It's not exactly the same story, but I could see a lot of similarities, and this robot that has incomplete programming, that's what allows it to make it, more human and a true friend to the kid, and some similarities to the Mitchells versus the Machines, but at the time that I worked on that movie, I was excited to work on it because I liked the director and the head of story a lot. I never worked with either one of them, but I thought we got along really well. And they were willing to kind of collaborate with me on all the scenes that I did. Like sometimes they would have a script, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they had a script that they were willing to completely rewrite and change. And so we really kind of crafted all the sequences that I did together, brainstorming, and I would do these really rough thumbnails and show them to them a lot. And so I was working really fast and loose, but I had a lot more authorship over what I was doing than I probably more than I've ever had before or since, except for maybe Home on the Range, actually. And I was doing scratch for like a couple of the characters, like this professor and one of the other robots, not the main robot in it. And but what was challenging for me was that I was much more at home drawing people and even more like animals or monsters or fantasy creatures or whatever. I had to learn how to do architecture and cars and things like that in the course of my career when they would end up being in the scenes that I was drawing. But I was much more comfortable drawing characters, and so learning to draw machines and futuristic cities and cars and tanks and guns, and fly, futuristic hovercopters and things like that were well outside of my comfort zone and wheelhouse. But it's like that was what the movie was about. It was about a robot. It was about this futuristic society, and so I just had to kind of dive in and figure out how to do that. And I have to say that by the end of that, I feel like, this is not as hard as I thought it would be. And I actually kind of enjoy doing it. If I had to do this again, I could do it. And I think I would do a competent job. I would say there was some of that when I was working on Joe Jump, which became Wreck-It Ralph as well, where I was doing a lot of, monsters with weapons and guns and armor, that had different kinds of futuristic, fantastical machines and vehicles that they would fly around in, a lot of video game stuff. And I wasn't I had not been a video game player for decades by the time I was working on this. And so I felt like I kind of had to dive in and do a lot of research and, draw a lot of different kinds of video game characters that were popular at the time. And then by the end of that, I felt like, hey, I could do this too. I could work on a video game or a video game movie if I had to. So yeah, you know, those are probably the ones as far as like artistically, you know, maybe I made the biggest, you know, leap forward or the biggest amount of growth, you know, and I had other kinds of growth on other films, you know, as well.
Well, no, it's really great to hear kind of that you've grown from that, and I can definitely understand like that movie. I watched it; it's on Netflix, and it's just kind of interesting to see. You know, it's just such a different movie, and I can definitely relate, like, you know, understand that a lot of the movies now that you mentioned are kind of similar to it. But yeah, I think it'd be kind of good now too, because I have a few listener questions. You can kind of fly through those, because I know we've talked for quite a long time. But yeah,
I was gonna say this was not 40 minutes or so.
Yeah, no, I mean, I really.
I'm glad you wanted to know all this stuff. That's great.
No, it's awesome. I feel like our listeners will like it too. But yeah, so I have a few questions. I know some of these kind of already have been answered. Yeah, so this one is from a person. Old Fashioned Boots is their name, I think, on here. They ask, what was your favorite role you ever had? And their message of thanks is, I love your work. You are so talented. And so I'm assuming they're trying to, you know, they're asking about favorite voice role.
Sure. Well, there's not a ton to pick from, but or at least not ones that were ever saw the light of day anyway. I mean, Rhino was certainly the one that got me the most. There was the most developed character that got me the most attention, and then I, you know, maybe opened up some other opportunities for me. I loved doing it, you know, because I got to do it for so long, you know, and they do little spin-offs for video games and commercials and whatnot. I you know, it's funny, I really enjoyed doing the voice of the professor, Dr. Rice, in the project we were just talking about, you know, the 7723, what became Next Gen, when he was a very different character. They were the kind of the way he was pitched to me at the time. They showed me this really weird commercial of this guy who could have been German or Dutch, I wasn't sure, and he was dressed up in, you know, lederhosen, and he was saying, "Look at these little machines I have created. You put them together, and they become living robots. You know, you can put these. Look, you put the third one, and it becomes a whole other robot creature. You know." I think it was some commercial from, I don't know, like the 90s. I don't remember. And so they said, this is kind of who we're going with, you know, this kind of wacky guy. And it was funny because I initially started drawing him, and he kind of looked like the way he ended up in the movie. But then they completely redesigned him to have these weird kind of this split hair that kind of came over to the side like antennae, you know, and this weird kind of Pinocchio nose and skinny face and big bug eyes. Very, very cartoonish, very, stylized. But the way I did his voice was kind of a mix of Dr. Strangelove, if you ever saw that movie, you know, this kind of wacky, you know, exaggerated German scientist, and the guy in that commercial, and Yoda, you know, and so I did because I basically traced the storyboards that they gave me to do was kind of tracing that character throughout the movie, you know, and all the interactions that he had with other characters and the way he develops over time. So I felt like I kind of got to know him, and so I was doing this voice for the scratch reels, and there was a lot of talk at the time of me doing the voice of the character, you know, when it was all done. My wife would wander in and hear me doing this. 77726, what are you doing? Why are you making my life so difficult? What are you thinking about, you know? And you know, I love doing that character, and I thought, man, this would be like my comeback if I actually got this role, and the movie did well. And then we had a pitch of the storyboard of the film to that point for the executives, and they decided they wanted to go in a very different direction with the story, and the director was not happy, and he quit, and the whole production was shut down for, I don't know, a couple of months, I think, and then it started up again, and they invited me back to keep working on it. And I had to say that I had just gotten an offer from another studio, for more money. and I just thought, and they said, oh, well, we could pay you a little bit more, but not as much as this other studio is paying you. And so, and I guess I'd all but accepted the offer. I said, well, I think we'll go here. And then as it turned out, the movie that I was on, I was only on it for like a couple of months, and then it crashed and burned. So uh, maybe I should have begged to stay on Next Gen, And then of course they got this professional comedian, David Cross, who was great, and the character, he's completely different, but he's much more serious and real, than what I would have done, and of course his character design reflected that, and it has this tragic ending as well. So, for what they did, I think they did a great job, and I understand why they went in a different direction. But oh, how I wish, even if nobody will ever hear that performance, I sure was proud of how I did with that. I have to say.
And Matt's wondering, how was the name Rhino picked for the hamster in Bolt?
Boy, I don't know. That's I'm unfortunately I did not have any part in that. The name was set before I came aboard. I'm pretty sure they were just trying to come up with a name that was as inappropriate for a hamster as possible, that would just kind of provide clues to what he thought of himself. When he talks about how, well, I'm 1/6, I'm only part hamster with a little Wolverine in there, and the dog talks about the lineage that he might possibly and most definitely does not have, in his warped little mind. It just shows what he thinks of himself, and how that he blows up Bolt to be bigger than he really is. And just has a very unrealistic worldview, and self view as well. But yeah, I don't know who came up. I mean, I would guess it was Chris Williams or maybe Nathan Greno or one of the other people that worked on the show. I don't know. If you find out the answer to that question, I would be curious to know.
Aiden is wondering, what are your PC specs? You got a RGB? Because we all know it gives 10% more frames per second.
Nothing that anybody would be very excited about, I have to say. I have a Mac, an iMac that is about 8 years old now, that is in desperate need of repair, at 27 inches and 500 gigabytes of storage. I think I maxed out the RAM, but there's not a lot you can do to customize them. Unfortunately, they are the way they are. Unless you know what I guess you could dig into them and invalidate the warranty, and I wouldn't dare to try any of that. So I have that, and it's too old, and it's starting to crash and have problems. So anybody out there that has any suggestions for what I should get instead, please be my guest. I've tried a number of different computers, a number of different mobile drawing solutions, because I always thought it would be great to be able to draw my storyboards while I'm traveling, or I'm on vacation, or in a bus, or on a plane, traveling home, or something like that. And the one that I have now, I have a Cintiq that I have hooked up to my desktop, that's also very old and probably needs to be replaced, but it works pretty well, and it was cheap because it was old and used. But the one that I have now that is working out the best for me is my iPad Pro. Actually, I really like the way the pencil works, and the iPad. It's the iPad Pro from 2 years ago, so not the most current version. It's a 9-inch, 9.5-inch, something like that. I really like drawing in fresco and in they finally got, the reason I got it was because they said they were going to get Photoshop available, and they didn't for like 2 years. The liars. And it still doesn't work the same as regular Photoshop does, but for what it is, it's not too bad. I love the pencil drawing tool in both of those programs, even if they're slightly different. And I as far as being able to do stuff on the go and having something lightweight and very responsive drawing with no lag. It's the best thing I've used so far, even if I hate the non-connectivity of iPads, the hoops that you have to jump through, saving it to the cloud or Google Drive or something like that before you can take it off and put it somewhere else, but just the experience of drawing itself on the thing and having it being very, very portable is the best I've experienced so far. If that means anything to anybody out there,
Tantbert is wondering, have you been getting less jobs as you get older?
I have, since you ask, I probably, maybe I'm making a mistake in being this frank. I will say that there are bigger gaps between my gigs than there used to be. It's funny because I went for 14 years at Disney, which is pretty long stretch. And there's people who were there when I started that are still there. I've been there for a very long time. Then I was at DreamWorks for 2 years. Then I was at Blue Sky for 6 months, and from there, actually, it's funny. I had a lot of jobs for the first 3 or 4 years after Blue Sky, most of which did not last longer than 6 months. A few lasted as many as 8 months, but there were often either very short gaps between them or they overlapped by a few weeks, actually. And there were some times where I was working like a couple of jobs at the same time. In the last 4 years, 4.5 years, I would say, the jobs that I have gotten have been typically for a shorter duration. And I've gone longer months between getting the next job, which, makes the nice thing about it is that these gaps in employment timed nicely with the birth of all 3 of my children. So I was actually able to help out with my wife, taking care of the kids and spending time with my kids, getting to know my kids, at the formative, important years that they had. But it also makes for a slightly more uncomfortable, frightening financial situation, where I don't know when I'm going to get the next job or who I'm going to work with, and I've done a lot more, before when I was doing independent work, I just would have work come to me and I would really have to ask around. Now I have to do a little bit more scrambling and asking around, to find out what jobs are out there, I'm getting by, but I don't have the comfortable cushion that I did have for a long time after leaving the studio. Having kids will do that too. I guess go through, births are nothing to sneeze at financially. And one thing that's happening, so I don't know if I mentioned that I work from home now. I do everything from home since for the last 8 years. After I moved back to my hometown of Utah, and there are a lot of advantages of that. One of the disadvantages is that it's outside of the union, IATSE 839 or the Animation Guild, whatever they're calling themselves now. So I have to pay for my own insurance 99% of the time, and that gets expensive. I don't get a lot of the freebies that I did when I worked in-house for a studio. And then there are big studios that don't have to pay me benefits because I don't live in the union's jurisdiction, whereas they would if I was there in Los Angeles. But I will say that I've gotten really interesting jobs, for a lot of different people I never would have heard of or worked for otherwise had I not stayed where I was, I suppose. So yeah, it's been interesting. And I've also, in the gaps that I've had between jobs, I've tried other things. I worked with a friend of mine on a children's storybook, which was something I thought about doing but never did. And the book came out, and I think it's doing pretty well from what I've heard. I've done T-shirt designs for friends of mine for charities that they run that I was pretty proud of. I did a movie poster for somebody once. I've done little art commissions, for friends of mine. Just some interesting little things. The last project I did was a live action movie that had animated characters in it, which I'd never done before. And as far as I know, that project is still going forward and we'll hit the theaters at some point. We'll see if we'll see if anything I did ends up in the film or not, So yeah, interesting. Nobody's ever asked me that question before. So I will also say that I have heard from friends of mine who are my age or a little older that they feel that ageism is a very real thing in our industry, that you know, they some of them ended up retiring much earlier than they planned on. Some of them who still work say that the people that are around them are a lot younger than they are, and that there's hardly anybody even close to their age that is still at the studios that they work for. I couldn't say if that's just their experience or if that is a worldwide trend or a trend that's specific to Los Angeles or to the United States. But for them, they felt like it was, I took like 3 or 4 people and they all said, oh yeah, it's going to the younger guys. I think part of that might be, there's more opportunities for high school students even to get an animation career, and to get very specialized training in the different, parts of producing animation. And of course, you can pay somebody who's younger and who has less experience, less money, than you would probably, you might feel obligated to pay somebody with a number of years of experience. Although there are people my age who are getting paid, who are working for a lot less than they did once upon a time. There are changes in the studios where Disney went from having people who were under contract for 3 and then 5 years to having no contracts, to where everybody's at will. They can quit at any time, they can fire you at any time, except for maybe directors or people that are kind of, in the production stages, heads of production that may have a run of film contracts, that even that may not be as ironclad. And I think that's kind of the direction that a lot of studios are going now, to where they have more flexibility to kind of let people go and bring new people on as they feel the need arises. So, on the other hand, there are many, many more studios to work for than there were when I started in this industry, So where one opportunity may go away, hopefully another one will take its place eventually,
Second last fan question. This is from a buddy of mine named Teddy. What was it like working with Disney on some of the most popular kids movies of the 2000s? So much respect for you and the cast. Bolt was still and is one of my favorite kids movies ever made by Disney. Thanks for making my childhood.
Well, I thank you. What a generous thing to say. It's funny because when I think I said that the timing was everything when I came to Disney. Right when all these amazing, extreme, they're still popular, still beloved, I think, to this day. The kind of the trio of the second golden age of animation. It's funny when I look back at my career, I feel like I kind of entered Disney at the top of the hill on a roller coaster, just before it started to slowly dip down and down, and and then I left the studio, and then it started to come back up again with Tangled, because I worked on a lot of movies that had increasingly diminishing returns, and there are movies that I know a lot of people never saw, or they look at as kind of the nadir of what Disney was doing at the time, rightly or wrongly, it's funny because I'm proud of Bolt, and I think it was a good movie, and I'm certainly glad that I got to have as much participation in it, not as a story artist, but as a character voice. But that movie came out the same weekend as Twilight premiered, and when we were doing the movie, there was talk of a sequel, of a franchise, of a TV show. Well, none of that ever materialized. They did make the video games, which were cool. But I think I do think the movie has grown in visibility and popularity over time. But I could be wrong, but I think at the time it was seen as a pretty big disappointment. Or at least it's certainly, I don't know if it lost money, but I think it did not perform. You'd have, some I might be wrong. Some people might disagree, but I don't. The impression that I got at the time was that it did not live up to the high expectations, or hopes at least, that people had for it, and I think the same could be said for Meet the Robinsons and certainly for Home on the Range, kind of the last hand-drawn, well, it was supposed to be the last hand-drawn film, then they tried it again with Princess and the Frog and the Winnie the Pooh movie, but that was kind of the mass exodus of the cleanup department and the in-betweeners, and of all those very specialized jobs that had no place at that studio or at any American studio after that, pretty much, outside of television, maybe. So yeah, it's hard. There were a lot of films that I worked on that did not do as well as I would have hoped, that a lot of people didn't know about or maybe didn't like as much as maybe they deserved to or not. Emperor's New Groove, I love that movie. It was a total disaster at the time that it came out. The studio was promoting 102 Dalmatians, if I remember at the time, and maybe one of the Santa Claus 2 movies or 3 movies, and so hardly anybody went to see Emperor's New Groove. But it has this very passionate underground following now to this day. Some people say it's their favorite Disney movie or one of their favorite Disney movies. There were movies that I worked on for years that never got made at all, like Wildlife and Joe Jump and the different iterations of Rapunzel, Tangled, King of the Elves I worked on, that never got, I don't think they're ever going to make that, or nothing like what I did or with any of the people that I was working on. So, it's funny. I think of myself as, being the kind of the ugly stepchild of Disney, when people say, did you work on Aladdin or The Lion King or BW's? No. Did you work on Tangled? I almost did. I remember after I'd left the studio, they released this video where Tangled, which was expected to bomb, Disney had already said, we're not going to do any more, animated musical fairy tales. And then, it's a huge blockbuster success, very quickly it's we're just not going to make any hand-drawn fairy tale musicals, princess movies. We're going to make lots of CGI princess musical movies, and then they made this video where somebody was painting around the studio and all the people say, we're a hit. Disney's back, baby. Yeah. And everybody's cheering and laughing and playing rock music. I'm like, gosh dang it. Why wasn't I there? I was so close. I was there. Go, man. So, but I learned a lot. I made lifelong friendships. I had many great and very memorable experiences, working there, which made it possible for me to do a lot of the other jobs and friendships and relationships that I did later in life, in my career. So, I have few regrets, and it warms my heart when somebody says, that they watched one of the movies that I contributed to in some way, let alone liked it. Tarzan, it's funny that was the first one I did where I probably had the least amount of creative input, but it was probably the most successful and well-liked movie of the ones that I worked on. And hey, but I was there. I did work on it, a little bit at least, as a trainee, novice, apprentice, storyboard artist at least, and so, well, good deal. I feel like I've burst a lot of bubbles out there, or 2 or 3 at least, but thank you all the same. If I did something that made a difference to you, then great, I succeeded. I feel validated now.
My sister is wondering, she's wanting to get into the maybe acting. Zane is wondering.
Don't do it, man. Don't do it. It'll ruin your life. You'll turn to drugs and booze and prostitution. You'll regret it forever. No, I'm kidding. Go ahead. What's your question?
What are some tips you would give to somebody who's wanting to get started in the industry of filmmaking, whether that be behind the scenes or on screen? She does a lot of makeup. She does a lot of gore makeup. It's just really disgusting stuff. But she does a lot of gore makeup. But she also is very enthusiastic about acting. So both of those coincide.
Well, I mean, some people would say you would take very different paths depending on whether you're going to go in front of the screen or behind the screen. Although there are certainly plenty of stories of people who start out as actors or performers or editors or whatever, that end up in the director's chair or the producer's chair or whatnot, and vice versa. You know, the one thing that I can think of that might be a through line to both of those careers that helped me out. I mean, the reason, as probably should be made clear, that I got to do any voices, let alone a semi well-known humorous sidekick in Bolt, was because I was in the right place again at the right time. I never would have gotten an acting gig, I don't think, a professional acting gig, had I not gotten in kind of sideways by being a story artist at Disney, and I know that there were a lot of other people who did scratch voices, who were editors or modelers or riggers or computer programmers or even receptionists, production assistants that had an acting knack and talent, and they learned things by the people from the people that they were working around, and they expressed their interests, and were given opportunities they might not have had otherwise, or maybe they would have had to wait a lot longer to have those opportunities. So I would say that if you're interested in acting or doing professional makeup or writing or directing or editing or producing or storyboarding or animating or any of those things, if you think you can afford to do it, get yourself an entry-level job as a production assistant or whatever jobs are available at that time. The pay will be terrible. The hours will be horrendous. You may not get a whole lot of respect or benefits or whatever, but what you will get is you'll make connections if you're respectful and you keep your ears and your eyes open and you're friendly with people. You'll get hopefully no promises, but chances are you'll get opportunities to show what you can do. I know one guy who was a production assistant when I was at Disney, who liked to draw. He was very keen on storyboarding, and when we were all working on Joe Jump, he showed some of his work. A lot of us were impressed. He got a job as a story artist. I don't remember if he ended up doing the internship that Disney was doing at the time. Maybe, probably, but everybody basically, he went out of his way to say, "Hey, so-and-so story artist, would you take a look at this? Tell me what you like, tell me what you don't like, what you would change." And he did that. He took it to heart. And now Will Mata, he's a very successful story artist. He's worked for Disney and for DreamWorks. I think he's still at DreamWorks. I'm not absolutely sure. He's been co-head of story. Maybe head of story on different things. And so I know that two of the people who ended up being the head honchos at Disney Animation started as production assistants, and then just kind of worked their way up all the way from the bottom through the system to the top, by learning as much as they could and, trying things and pitching things and talking to people, and taking and being there when opportunities arose, and I'd say the same thing for voice acting. If you don't think you're going to have an opportunity to get a voice agent, or to, if you can't afford to go to a prestigious acting school. I mean, if you can, of course, do those things, take those opportunities. But, if you want a little shortcut, find a video game or an animation or a movie or a TV studio that has an entry-level job, and tell them, "Hey, I like acting. Can I do this background character here? Or can I audition for this? Can I take a crack at it?" And they'll chances are they'll say, "Sure, why not?" And if you actually have some talent, you might get an in, and it could turn into a whole career. You just never know. Yeah, the best advice outside of that I could give you is, whatever you're interested in doing as far as movies or TV or whatever, learn as much as you can. Watch watch whatever kinds of movies or media that you're interested in, figure out what they did right, what they did wrong, why what works the way that it does. Read as many books as you can, tell as many stories, do your own storyboards or scripts or whatever, of the thing, of the job that you'd like to do. Show it to people. When you have opportunities to talk to professionals or to teachers, show them your stuff, listen to them, take notes. If you get different kinds of advice from different people, well, show it to more people and see what the most people say, learn as much as you can, do as much as you can, and work on your portfolio, make your portfolio as polished and professional as you possibly can, and be ready to show it to people when the need arises.
Awesome.
I would say.
Thank you so much for answering the listener questions, and just thank you for coming on to the show. And I really appreciate you coming on to talking about what you've worked on all these years, and just kind of sharing your story. It will definitely impact our listeners and teach them some important lessons on in the industry. But yeah, I'll include Mark's website in the description of the podcast. But thank you again, Mark, for coming on, and you guys have a great rest of your day.